Yes, and I can sometimes I pause, and it's a scary thought to imagine what sort of things are out there in space pointing at us right now, and what sort of capacities for destructions are out there. And it is really petrifying. In a sense, of course, it seems like, and we at some point you recommended that I read this book by Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations, which I thought was a fascinating book to read. It was very interesting to see how long some of those conflicts have been really evolving. But the thing that has changed so radically in the last decade is, of course, the magnitude of capacity for absolute annihilation. And so that's really, I mean, other than that, you look back into the age of the Crusades, and it doesn't look too different in some sense. What was going on back then seems scarily reminiscent to what's going on now, because I guess it's all instinct based. It's human beings doing what human beings do because we've run out of natural predators, and they're just driven by their instincts. But it's been amplified to such a scary degree. I mean, I don't know. Do you think it's a reasonable way to think about it?
Well, one thing did happen in 1945. For centuries, Europe had been the most savage, violent, barbaric place in the world. Europeans' main joy was to slaughter one another. In the 17th century, the 30 Years' War, which was fought over such deep questions as how to handle the Eucharist, killed about a third of the population of Germany. This century, the last century, the two world wars were practically destroyed Europe twice. Well, 1945, Europeans it finally penetrated to them that the next time they have a war, it'll all be over. So now they have football games.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a step forward. Not a very promising one, because it's based on the existence of weapons which very likely will destroy us if we continue on this path. But there are steps. As I said, over 120 countries just did establish the Treaty for Prevention of Production of Nuclear Weapons. More can join. There can be more nuclear weapons-free zones. There can be further efforts to dismantle the destructive apparatus that we're constructing. And there can be pressure, popular pressure, to move towards negotiations and diplomacy in the areas where there's conflict, instead of sending naval armadas and carrying out provocative military actions on the Russian border and so on. But there's a lot to worry about. Just to mention something else, there's an OPEC meeting going on, the oil cartel.
Yeah.
And they're apparently deciding to significantly increase the use of fossil fuels because demand is going up. Total suicide. They all know perfectly well that their own countries are going to be destroyed. Saudi Arabia can increase production of petroleum. Global climate will go up. Saudi Arabia will be uninhabitable. It's not going to survive. But no matter, we have to make more money tomorrow. That's the human race.
Yes, it almost looks like money is it's an interesting point, actually. Money on such global scale, it's hard to grasp what that even means somehow. I mean, what is the difference between having 5 billions and 7 billions? I mean, I wouldn't know, but it seems like at some point it just becomes arbitrary, and again, it's just to have a ranking of power, and that's about it, right? Or how would you put it?
If you live in a social and cultural system where the crucial value is being ahead, that's going to happen. There's a fascinating book that just came out, it's coming out soon, by David Graeber, great anthropologist who died recently, and forgotten the name of his co-author, but it brings forward a mass of information that has been developed during the last couple of years about what we call indigenous societies for the last 30,000 years and their interaction with Western societies, particularly during the 17th and 18th century period of the Enlightenment and the conquest of the Americas, genocidal conquest. It really makes you totally rethink the whole history of our culture and civilization and of the interactions with the indigenous world. Turns out they were way ahead of us in almost every respect, except material goods. There's a long
Sounds
record.
like a fascinating book to read.
Oh, it's incredible. And their critique, they had a very sophisticated critique of Western society. Turns out was very influential in the West. Graeber argues that it's the source of Enlightenment ideas about democracy, equality, and so on, was the indigenous critique of the backward character of the savage European civilizations. Worth reading. Very much alive today. Right in the today, all over the world, on the climate crisis. Who's in the forefront? Indigenous people everywhere. First Nations in Canada, Aboriginal people in Australia, the tribal people in Brazil and Mexico and in India. They're in the forefront of trying to save the world while we're racing to destroy it. Well, it's kind of a replay of what was happening in the 17th century.
Yeah, it sounds like we definitely need to learn to listen a little bit better there. Speaking about anthropology, you know, I at some point read an interesting book by Desmond Morris, who made a point that, and it may be a bit too simplistic, and maybe I'm not quite quoting it correctly, but he basically said that all human actions can be somehow connected to the desire to drive for power, and that then he classified power into two categories: power that one experiences by destroying something, and power one experiences by creating. And then he said that on top of that, of course, to create is harder than to destroy. That's why children, oftentimes, when they want to experience power, they will destroy things, they will destroy their toys and so on. And then when they grow up, they will try, sometimes at least, hopefully, to create. And so I'm just wondering, where it seems that so much is driven by power in the negative sense, how do we inspire people? I feel in order to tell, one cannot just tell people to stop. One needs to somehow give them an inspiration for something that will be more naturally more exciting. So that's sort of something that comes from within, because if it's not from within, it's not going to work. It's imposed from above. It's sort of something that becomes reminiscent too much of a system that I witnessed growing up collapsing, and I don't want to see that again. So how does one inspire people to create? And what are the words? And can one even express that in language? Should one think about music a little bit more? what do we have as resources? What do you think?
Well, for one thing, comparative studies, like the Graeber book that I mentioned, suggest at least that what you described, the race for power, is a characteristic of European civilization, which after all is a civilization that arose in a corner of northwest Europe at a time when the major centers of civilization were in China and India. And there was a group of barbarians off in Northwest Europe who were very effective in the means of war. They were way ahead of the rest of the world in the means of destruction and savagery. That's how they were able to conquer the world. But it's a very special civilization. It includes Russia as well, which expanded and has become the dominant world system. But is that human nature? Or is that the particular form of Western savagery that developed from this little barbarian corner of the world? I think that's worth thinking about. Another very interesting book about this, if you want to look into it, is a book by a great historian, William Polk, died recently. It's called Crusaders and Jihadis. It's a study of the 1,000-year war of the North against the mostly Muslim South. It's a very revealing book. I think there's a lot of rethinking to do about the nature of world civilization. A lot of what we take to be human nature is a particular form of social and cultural organization that developed in Europe in what was then a very backward area.
That sounds very interesting. Sounds like a book I should also put on my list to read. Yeah.
I mean, we don't want to romanticize. It's not
Yes.
that the world was just a lovely place until the Europeans came along, but there is something to rethink about this.
Yes. The worry is, of course, and we are seeing this, that if you're peace-loving, what are your means of dealing with a war-loving society or civilization? That's I don't know, I'm not quite sure. I am not an evolutionary anthropologist, but I've seen people discuss things that in essence one can think of. There's war machines and civilizations that use different types of war machines be subject to similar types of evolutionary pressure in the Darwinian sense. And so if one thinks about it like this, it's sort of intimidating to think that if I don't want to be part of it. I remember when I moved to Germany from Russia in 1994, there was this beautiful slogan, which I thought was absolutely wonderful. And that was, "Stell dir vor, es ist Krieg und niemand geht hin," which means imagine there is war, but nobody goes. And of course, if nobody goes, then there is no war. But the thing is that it takes everybody not to go. And as soon as some small group decides to take advantage of the fact that nobody else is going, then yes, gets us right back into this trouble.
I think we should be very cautious about invoking evolutionary pseudo-arguments. Evolution shows everything, shows cooperation. One of the major factors in evolution is cooperation. We see it in animals all over the place. Take a look at an ant colony. It's almost a single organism based on mutual support and cooperation. Take a look at our closest relatives, apes. You can find aggressive, militant ape groups like chimpanzees. You can find what primatologists call nature's hippies, bonobos. No war, they work out cooperative means. They're just as close to us. Not very close, 12 million years away. But you can find anything you want in nature.
Yes, well, so there is hope. And I was thinking, you look at how the world, we emailed about that briefly, how the world handled COVID-19. And, so what if we take that as a wake-up call, I think that could be taken as a wake-up call, that this is how our species, at least currently, is handling such a horrible event. And it could have been more synergistic, perhaps, and less.
Well, actually, if we look at it, the lessons are quite interesting. So let's go back a year, early 2020. Germany, Austria, rich countries had pretty well handled it. It was under control by the spring of 2020. Then Europeans decided they want to have their summer vacations. Don't want to dispense with that. Okay, go off for their summer vacations. Big rise in COVID in the fall, naturally, because you had to have your summer vacations. There was something else going on at the time. Although Germany and Austria had it pretty well in control, a couple of kilometers to the south, northern Italy, there was a major outbreak.
Yes, Bergamo.
Germany, Austria, and Italy are in something called the European Union. Did the rich countries send support to northern Italy to deal with their pandemic? Did they send doctors, medical equipment? No, for ourselves. We don't help other people, just for ourselves. Well, that's not the end of the story. There is one genuinely internationalist country in the world, and they sent doctors. Cuba, under the jackboot of the United States, virtually being crushed. But they were able to provide aid to northern Italy.
I didn't know that about Cuba. I remember I believe I read that Russia sent a plane or something like that. I didn't know about Cuba.
Well, of course, because we don't talk about that. We're not allowed to talk about it. We're not allowed to talk about the fact that one of Trump's last actions was to pressure Panama, which has, like most of Latin America, has a serious COVID crisis, pressure Panama to expel Cuban doctors who were there to help. They're the only ones who come to help, but we have to make sure to expel them. As the Trump administration put it, we have to prevent the malign influence of Cuba, namely genuine internationalism, sending doctors to help in other places. Well, that's two aspects of human nature.
Yes, that's that's quite horrible. I didn't know about that.
Because we don't talk about it. You don't talk about those things. What you talk about is what you can read in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, just came out. Lead article on how there's a conflict developing between the liberal rule-based United States pressing for democracy, human rights, and so on, and then conflict with the autocratic world led by China, with countries like Cuba and Russia. That's what's developing. And try to talk to a Latin American audience about this. Collapse with laughter.
Yes.
Seen the rule-based democracy promotion of the United States, plenty of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you know, I grew up in Russia and we left Russia back in the 90s. There were very good reasons for doing so. But then when I look at how people, not so much in Europe, but predominantly in the US, are taught, I mean, it seems like, you know, there's a fundamental difference in teaching people how to think and teaching people what to think. And when it comes to Russia in particular, people are taught what to think, and so strongly that there is just, I remember back in 2016 or whenever this whole anti-Russian wave started. And, you know, I don't really take sides in the sense, I mean, I love Russia in the sense that it's a country that gave me birth and education. That's where I learned to play the cello. I love Europe because that's where I got my secondary education. I love the US because that's where I do my Alzheimer's research. But I'm interested in understanding, I mean, what's actually true. And that seems to be hard. And I mean, I'm not glorifying Russia. I mean, they surely have their own ways of saying similar things with the opposite sign about other countries. But it's just scary to me to see how little people are willing to just pay attention and think for themselves. I mean, I really don't know. It shouldn't be such an exception in the world where there's so many good books to read and so much information available. Instead, people are all glued to their smartphones and are collecting pseudo information and try, based on that pseudo information, to come up with pseudo realities about the world. And so it's really scary stuff, actually.
It is, but the good part is there are really answers to all of the crises that we face. There are possible ways to deal with it, which are feasible. It's true of nuclear weapons, what we started with. It's true of the climate crisis. It's true of the educational crisis, which you're talking about. There are ways to overcome it. Question is, do we have the will and commitment to implement them? And it's not impossible. As long as there's some opportunity, there's hope, and we can pursue it.
Yes, we absolutely must. I mean, if we give up, that's it.
That's the end. We can't.
That's the end of the story.
Got another interview coming in a couple of minutes.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for making the time for this. I found it really, really illuminating.
Very a chance to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye.